write-in ban. So in other words, what SB6 does is, if you vote for a write, they allow you to vote for a write-in candidate. They don't, but then what happens is they don't count that vote, and they don't tell you they're not going to count it. So that's one thing in the lawsuit, one of the two things. That violates flat out the California state constitution, because there what it says is that if you cast a vote, it must be counted, must, no ifs or buts. So this just flatly violates this. This is just a question of black and white. There is no gray here. It's pure and simple. So that's one of the arguments that is in our brief that we just filed this morning in federal court.
No, state court.
I'm sorry, it's state court. It's been going on low sleep lately.
So, I mean, how did that happen? Like, how did people accidentally vote in this law that would?
You want to talk about that? This is quite a good story.
That wouldn't count their votes.
Right. Well, think back to what was this thing actually on the ballot? What does this say?
09.
09. Okay. February of 2009, the state legislature was trying to pass a budget. California is one of the few states that requires a 2/3 vote of the legislature to pass a budget. And the Democrats were in favor of passing a budget. Republicans were not. Most of the Republicans were not. And the legislature was short in the state Senate the one vote that they needed to pass a budget. So then State Senator Abel Maldonado, who is now Lieutenant Governor and running for re-election as Lieutenant Governor, should people want to extract some revenge, he basically cut a deal with a Democratic majority. He said he would vote for the budget if they would put on the ballot some legislation that he authored. He didn't write it, but he was the legislative author of it, that would change the primary system from the existing semi-closed system that we have to a blanket top 2 primary, where everybody's on the ballot, on the primary ballot, irrespective of what party they are in, and then the top 2 vote getters, again, irrespective of what party they're in, are in a runoff in November. And that was his price. He would vote for the budget if the legislature would pass SB 6 and pass Senate Constitutional Amendment 4, which would then become Prop 14 on the ballot this past June. The legislature felt they had a gun to their head, and so that's what they accepted. I guess perhaps the majority party and a lot of Republicans who didn't like this bill either, the Republican Party came out against Prop 14 as well. I guess they assumed that maybe they would have an opportunity to defeat it at the polls. But that was basically how it ended up on the ballot. And again, we tried to have a campaign against Prop 14. We were not as well funded as the proponents of Prop 14. One of the things that we learned from Watergate is follow the money. One of the consequences of Prop 14 is that it's going to increase the cost of campaigns. Because if you're running for governor, for example, you have to campaign statewide for all the voters in June, and again, if you're one of the top 2, statewide for all of the voters in November. I mean, look at how much Meg Whitman, for example, has been spending how much she spent to win the Republican nomination. That was just to get Republicans to vote for her in June. Well, she was going to have to do the same thing, and now she's spending a lot of money to get all the voters to vote for her in November. Well, think of all the money that would have to be spent to get all the voters to vote for you twice. So it's going to increase the cost of campaigning, which increases the leverage of those deep pocket organizations, a lot of the big businesses that were the primary supporters of Prop 14. So that's how it ended up on the ballot. And then, of course, they're not going to tell the voters the real reasons, so they do what I said before. They lay out some legitimate problems that the state is facing, and then they put in a solution, quote unquote, that sounds like it will solve the problem, but really won't solve the problem. It'll accomplish these other ends, which I'd like to call them unintended, unintended consequences, but they're actually intended consequences. One of the things that and maybe Richard Winger can speak more to this, one of the consequences of Prop 14 is that it will effectively, in a few election cycles, eliminate the minor parties from their ballot qualification status. There was a similar measure on the ballot some years ago that had a fix to that that would allow minor parties to maintain, or make it easier for them to maintain their ballot status in the face of a top two primary that similar to what Prop 14 puts forth. The people who wrote Prop 14 deliberately left that out, and maybe I should turn this over to Richard, who can relate the conversation that he had.
And before we go to Richard, I want to add one detail. This bill was literally never saw the light of day. It was introduced at 3 a.m. on February 19th, 2009, and it was passed at, I believe, 6:55 a.m. on February 19th, 2009. So no one had ever heard of it. It was just passed just in a big hurry. And I'm not sure how many lawmakers were aware of everything that was in it. What is also notable is that nowhere in the summaries, the legislative summaries for SB 6's bill, did it mention that it would disenfranchise voters. That is extremely misleading and worse, because it was basically, it did not warn people of one of the fundamental problems with the legislation. So, but with that,
I just wanted to add that the legislature had to waive the provision in the Constitution that requires bills be in print for at least 3 days before they're voted on. The Constitution allows them to waive that, and they did waive that. Again, they had this gun held to their head, that if they wanted Maldonado's vote on the budget, they had to waive that provision, they had to pass these bills.
There's a lot of things wrong with Prop 14 and SB 6 that we're not suing over. You should not think this is going to be the last lawsuit. But the really bad thing that it does is it cuts minor parties out of the general election campaign season. We've tried the system twice before in 2 other states, Louisiana and Washington. We know how it works. Minor parties do not do well in the first round because people aren't paying attention to them. So, because you have to come in first or second in the first round in order to campaign for the rest of the time, that's the end of minor party campaigns. Even Audie Bach, who was elected to the legislature as a Green Party nominee in 1999 from Oakland, in the first round, she came in third. She only got 8%. So under this system, that would be the end of her. Under the system that was actually in place, she got into the runoff and she won. Same way with Jesse Ventura. He was in the Minnesota open primary in September 1998. He only got 3% of the vote, and any voter was free to vote for him. They had to choose to vote in the Reform Party primary, but they did that in the secrecy of the voting booth. So under this system, he would have been wiped out, and yet in the system that was actually used, he won. So I'll say one more thing. The press has not noticed at all. There was another bill in the legislature last year, ACA 6, by Assemblyman Charles Calderon. He also proposed a top 2 system, but only for state office. That had been sitting there, it had had hearings, people could have evaluated it. It was much better. All the proponents of this say, oh, we have to pass this to fix state government. State government is broken. Well, why didn't they pass ACA 6? Why did they have to ruin congressional elections? If you see a supporter of 14, you should bring that up.
I mentioned that, we tried to get the message out about Prop 14. Many of the newspapers refused to interview the opponents. They only got, their editorial boards only asked the proponents of Prop 14 to come in and give presentations. Same thing with many chambers of commerce organizations. Those chambers of commerce that did hear from both sides decided not to support Prop 14.
That's right.
But those that only heard from the one side, of course, supported it.